Everyone, to the information series. It is hosted by the Manitoba FASD Coalition and the Manitoba FASD Family Network. So thank you so very much for attending. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to mention some housekeeping items. Please turn off your mics and cameras. Please put your questions in the chat box and Laura will ask them at the end of the presentation. Or if you'd like to ask your own questions, you just have to unmic yourself. Evaluations will be emailed out. Please take a few minutes to fill them out. This is a wonderful way for our committee to know what people would like to hear. And our next information series will be May 6th, and we are in the process of finalizing it, but it will be along the line with teachers talking about FASD within the school system. And as you probably know, this presentation is being recorded, and Kim had emailed out the presentation to the people that are registered. And I think that is it. So it gives me great privilege and an honor to welcome to our information series today, Dignity, Spirit of Truth and Reconciliation. And again, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Grandma Debbie. Debbie is a board member of the Manitoba FASD Coalition and also our treasurer. Debbie is one of the many grandmothers in the Indigenous community and provides cultural services at Life's Journey, Indigenous Spiritual Care Services. Welcome, Grandma Debbie.
Oh, miigwech Joanne, long time friend. Oh, bonjour everyone. Minno Gagigidu Mikinak is my spirit name. The grannies and grandmothers named me, and the beautiful name that my mom and dad named me is Deborah. And the clans that I am so honored to be inclusive of is the Wabishke Ninukmakwa and Mikinet Dundun, and that is that is my polar bear clan and the turtle clan. So I want to begin by speaking on the land acknowledgement that we carry here with the Manitoba FASD Coalition. We acknowledge that we all gather on and work on the treaty lands of Manitoba, traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Denny's people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I want to begin with a purification ceremony with all of us, because this is, my intention is that this beautiful work of the grannies and grandfathers that guided me to bring to you today brings deep heart ishkute learning in your heart, Zongagawan, the love. So let's begin with a smudge. Our eyes to see clearly, our ears to hear clearly, our mouth to speak good, and our heart to feel the blessings. And so I want to acknowledge the Wabang Jawanong Nigibuang Giwetinong and Imama Aki. I want to also acknowledge Nindidi Gishko and Nakomish Nibwa Gizis and Mishomish Gizis. I also want to acknowledge the earth spirit, Ki Manitou. I want to acknowledge the water spirit, Nibi Manitou, as well as the air spirit, Gishiko Manitou. And I also want to acknowledge the fire, Ishkote Manitou. I also want to ask for a blessing for each and every one of us here today, grandmothers, Nakomish, Mishomish, and that we all have a good time of taking care of each other. So I give thanks, Nakomish, Mishomish, for being beside me, those grandfather ancestors that have guided us here today. So I want to say, Gishi Miigwech, a kind thank you to each and every one of you today. So Miigwech, let's begin. There's lots of slides here. So in honor of our ancestors, we want to speak about the diversities across Manitoba, which is so important, as well as the diversities in Indigenous peoples. And of course, we'll start with that, First Nations, Métis, non-status, and Inuit. We also want to acknowledge the ways of greeting Bonjour, Ojibwe, Tansei, Anin, Wachachote, and Hohan, Wapiti, Dakota, and Tanshe for Michif, and Ajachote for Inuk. So all of these are really important pieces of the diversities of language across Manitoba. Earlier, we have counseling resources because we are going to speak about some of the very traumatic and hurtful things that have happened to people, to our survivors and our ancestors that are now in spirit, but also our children today. So if you're ever triggered, there is resources here. They're going to be put in the chat and so forth. And of course, Andrea, thank you, Andrea, for being available if people need to process further after this presentation. So, turtle is the truth. Before reconciliation, we need to learn about the truth. And one of the most important truths is that 40 to 50 years ago, the Indian residential schools began to close after the public became aware of the cultural, physical, and sexual abuse that occurred in those schools. That is a very bottom line, very strong truth. And that turtle represents all the teachings on our back, but also most importantly, the truth. So, but what's really important is the Indigenous unity teaching. As you see here, we have 4 cardinal directions, and each one represents diversity of all peoples on Mother Earth. So the circle of life medicine wheel teaches us about connection, harmony, and balance. All are joined in a huge diversity in the spirit of unity in the circle of life. We also want to acknowledge diversity in spiritual beliefs and practices in language and teachings. And some of those examples could be, there are different diversities in dialect of Cree and Ojibwe, and Dakota and Lakota Val as well. But also, there are diversities in those teachings. We see here, we have the 7 grandfather teachings: love, respect, honesty, humility, courage, wisdom, and truth. But we also have the Dakota values of prayer, respect, honesty, humility, generosity, and care and compassion. And so we want to acknowledge the huge diversities of all peoples on Mother Earth, and how the circle of life embraces everyone in unity. But most importantly, we need to learn a little bit of history. And I'm only going to touch a bit of information here, but most important information that gives us a picture. So in 1867, the Indian Act was established. And in the act, there were many things that happened that really oppressed Indigenous, my ancestors, as well as many of our people, even all nations of people, or people that came from the England too, who tried to help the Indigenous people, but those Indian Act policies stopped them from helping Indigenous people. In 1872, the Indian residential schools, and also called industrial schools, were established. And right parallel around that time, Stony Mountain Institution was established, the creation of incarceration of Indigenous people. In 1881, again, the Indian Act began. The Indian Act agents were assigned to different reserves to control the actions of First Nations people. They were like gatekeepers, but they basically said, you can leave here at this time, but you have to be back at that time, and you can only sell this much, and you can only do that. So it was kind of a jail within the reserves that people could move. So again, that it was a huge piece of survival. So in 1884, the anti-potlatch and Sundance laws were enacted under the Indian Act, and the law was passed that it was illegal for 3 or more Indians to gather in discussions. I don't like the word Indians, but I'm using it for verbatim of what was possessed onto the indigenous, my ancestors. And I want you to pay attention to that medicine mill on the side in the east direction, where I have that nice big X on the spirit, because everything that was put into time harmed the spirit of indigenous people. And again, there's disclosure of the Prime Minister John A. Macdonald speaking about the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and to assimilate Indian people as speedy as possible as they see fit. They're fit to do that. The assimilation goals are there. And Duncan Campbell Scott spoke about the Indian problem, absorb them as soon as possible into larger society. And you'll see as we go along here, in 1914, the indigenous people needed to seek official permission to appear in Indian costume in any kind of public event. So these beautiful earrings that that I'm wearing right now would need to be, and my braids too, would need to be, and my ribbon skirt, I've got it on, I would have to get permission. So these are part of my spirit. Many of these things are part of our ancestors' spirit. Now, in 1920, there's a no Indians left policy that was put together. From the 1920s to the 1980s, a piece that's not been in my presentations is the federal Indian Day schools are put into place. Now, my grandmother is 100 years old now, and I'm so blessed to have her. But can you imagine my grandmother? And I think about my great-grandfather because he was a medicine man. And he couldn't wear his traditional Crow clothing or in any way appear Indian in public. So right now, I would need to take out my braids and my skirt and my earrings and not be in the public. And I think about my great-grandfather, and I think about all the things he had to do. He had such an surmountable amount of knowledge around traditional healing practices. He actually had to bury his bundle. And it was quoted that he used to do devil worshiping, is what my grandmother told me. But again, we're looking at many things that happened between 1922 that is just too much here to put on this presentation, but there's a lot of stuff, and I encourage everybody to research and find out more. But again, the key piece is that spirit, this spirit. And as time goes on, and because of the disclosures and the public finding out about the schools and how people are treated, Parliament now begins to change somewhat. In 1951, they appeal the Indian Act provisions of anti-potlatch, which means people can gather, which means that people can restore somewhat cultural practices. But from what I understand, a lot of indigenous communities did not practice that until probably further into the late 70s, 1980s, 90s. So in 1950, first sets of students leave the Indian residential schools after the removal of the alcohol ban. So we want to pay attention to 1950, after the removal of the alcohol ban. In 1959, the 60 scoop is implemented. In 1967, Manitoba's Children's Aid is enacted. And in 1996, the last Indian residential school closes in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. There, in this presentation, you'll see that the 60 scoop and the Manitoba Children's Aid is another form of assimilation and colonization. So we want to pay attention to the whole structure of cultural identity. As you can see, I got the big X and everything, and it really is the core of identity. As you'll see, culture, family, community, nation, stories, and then all of these are removed up until now in this present day, where we'll get into the presentation more, and I'll show you how things are changing and how we are learning about the truth to restore dignity and reconciliation. So we want to speak about 1867. Those residential schools, the parents were forced to send their children and put under threat and prosecution to send their children to the schools. And that's why Stony Mountain Penitentiary was enacted, so that if any of the families who resisted would be put into, would be charged and put into jail for not complying with what their intentions were. And it was the norm for children to attend these schools in the 19th and 20th century. And they were operated by the religious groups in the early years. And then because the public found out about what was happening, the government control over in the later years. And the residential schools prohibited those languages, culture teachings, practices, and customs. Many of the children weren't able to see each other for many years or for months. And there were stipulations on how, where, and when. Many thousands of children were enrolled in the schools, while most were status, but Inuit and Métis and non-status Indians, as well as children of Caucasian nations, attended these schools and experienced abuses too. Regardless of the number involved, Indigenous people have paid a high price across Canada, both collectively and individually, for the government misguided experiment on cultural assimilation. Quote, Aboriginal Healing Foundation, 2003. The abuses were numerous, everything from physical abuse, neglect, torture, humiliation, bullying, sexual abuse at the hands of staff and clergy, abuse, and non-student abuse. Abuse was directed towards individuals that were part of a larger project to suppress culture and identity. So Indigenous communities continue to feel the impacts of what some call cultural genocide. And some of those impacts on the parents, you know, having your child removed and you're being threatened, otherwise you go to jail, or rations would be cut off. And these were things that, so as you see, the exit gain is not only affecting the individuals, it's affecting the whole family, the community, and that First Nations. Many parents had to deal with the emotional grief and loss of devastating effects of separation and the breakdown of communities and the lack of input in the care of their children. And most often, those parents went to the schools and experienced the abuses and knew that this is what would happen to the children, but they had no choice and no input in the care and protection of their children. Lots of grief and loss has resulted in addictions and societal problems in many communities, but we are healing today. So there are incidents that happened at the school, and I'll touch on a few of them. Inadequate food and clothing, enforced replacement of spiritual beliefs by religious teachings, stripped of your braids, stripped of your clothing, possessions. Anything that was given to the children to bring to the schools were thrown in the garbage. There were uses of DDT, cleansing of the hair. There weren't any parental role models, and there was severe sexual abuse and confinement in some of the schools. Electrical chairs were used as punishment as well, noted in Ontario. And some of the threats that were made to the children after being abused is, you'll never see your children again. And this also is parallel to the day schools and probably the 60 scoops homes where children were taken, as well as foster care. So you will lose visitation. You won't get any mail. They'll withhold food, or you'll die, or you will be hurt even worse. All these threats, or you'll go to hell. No one will ever believe you. And I firsthand heard all of these because I spent a good almost 11 years working with the survivors and their children. The truth. The Indian residential schools were closed after the public became aware of cultural, physical, and sexual abuse that occurred at the schools. They began to change. But in that, we paid attention to 1950 and the children that are coming home. And there's a beautiful presentation that our Robert here that we have for viewing. He speaks about the alcohol teaching and why does the misuse of alcohol play such a huge role. I've got some pictures here of 170 years of trauma. When we go back to the mission schools that began, even further back to when they officially established the schools, there's 170 years of trauma that the communities have dealt with. So as adults, many farmer students struggled along with the pain. We're going to talk about 170 years of pain, rage, grief, loss, unresolved trauma, resulting in high levels of misuse of alcohol, especially when the children from the 1960s on, late 1959 and 1960s, where the alcohol ban was lifted in the Indian Act, in that timeline, many of those former students reached for the alcohol, misuse of it in order to cope. So they sought escape by use of alcohol, marriage, domestic partnership, which was often very overwhelming by the complexities of intimacy, parenting, and family life, and not knowing how to parent or to be a family without a previous experience or perception for its demands, because most often there was violence in the schools. And, you know, normally we put our children to bed, we have a family time. This was not demonstrated and role modeled in the schools. So there's more re-victimization when coming into partnerships and domestic violence. These are some of the impacts of those former students becoming involved or being abusers of themselves to their children or their parents and partners. Then after leaving the schools, many students struggle to fit into the First Nations community, which is the huge impact of assimilation and colonization, with thousands of former students struggling with identity and belongingness. So this little circles here, the children are coming out of the schools, going back to their homes, not able to speak their language, not able to remember cultural identity, if there's practices and what their family is doing. Yet again, generations are embedded with that process. So they're reaching to mainstream, not fitting in there as well because of the color of their skin. And so that identity and belongingness is a big, huge piece to assimilation and colonization. And so we want to talk about the risks. What are the risks and challenges? Again, the abuse and neglect the former students suffered at the schools left deep, huge wounds within in their adult lives, but never spoke of it. They were never taught to parent, only shown violence, attachment, issues with self, their own self. They had no bonds of love and trust and caring and unmet needs. There's lots of post-traumatic stress. There was a high risk for apprehension. In 1967, Children's Aid Society comes in, and that does devastating effects on how Children were institutionalized again in foster care and group homes. Some of those issues around the attachment affected them emotionally, spiritually, physically, intellectually, child, youth, and adult, not knowing it's that cycle continuing on and not knowing how to get the help to end the cycle of violence and hurt and harm. So the impacts disrupt those connections to the family community. The impacts interrupted the grandparents, the great grandparents, the parents, and that child trying to bond with that in that circle of life and struggling with the effects of the trauma for many years. So when we go back to 1990s, that's just a very 30 short years ago, which we are now coming into the great great grandchildren. And so we're going to talk more about intergenerational trauma being reinforced by racist attitudes that continue to permeate Canadian society today. And that is very real. So we want to start to become aware of some of those impacts of disruptions of trauma on the family. Again, we look at the circle of life and how it affects the individual, how it affected the family, community, nation, and that culture. So we want to look at a few of these things: the inability to effectively handle conflict in healthy ways, fear of authority figures, anger towards school and parents, the individuals struggling with post-traumatic stress, cultural shame, mental health such as anxiety, depression, lack of trust for self, inability to express about feelings, and abuse suffered in the schools, silence, secrets, and not talking about it. Difficulty parenting again, loss of stories, loss of tradition, and yes, family violence, addiction, very much unresolved grief of history in the family, but also the nation. Lots of connection to the language, culture, communal violence, again, loss of togetherness, collective support, loss of support from the elders. The elders are losing their teachings. That there were a few elders that went underground to ensure that they restored and kept those teachings and made it clear not to speak of them, but only in the right place and time. And thank goodness for that. Lack of communal raising of children. You know, that communal raising of children was so important. Like aunties raising their nieces and nephews, or, you know, even if you weren't a blood relative, you were an auntie or a kokum to that child. That's the ways of knowing, the ways of living, the ways of an indigenous circle of life of love and support to the community. So we also look at the initiatives, the gain dependency on others throughout the years, the dependency of many services that continue to affect people today. Look at the intergenerational trauma, and this is called that hidden legacy. Thankfully, it's not as hidden anymore, and I'm just grateful. And these pictures demonstrate a lot of the hidden legacy struggles for individuals that have coped from the trauma. So there are a lot of left individuals with unresolved feelings of hurt, pain, shame, guilt, deep-rooted traumatic wounds, being ashamed of being Indigenous. And so the other thing that I found when I worked in the work with the children of the survivors is they didn't even know their parents went through this, but they just didn't understand why their parents acted the way they did, because they did witness other families receiving love and care, and they couldn't quite understand. And the survivors would disclose that they couldn't speak about it to their children. It was just such traumatic pain. And that was in the early 2006, 2005, when I began working in the work of the Indian residential schools, health support for the former students and their children. It really was the hidden legacy. So there's a huge impacts of trauma, and using the medicine when we look at the spiritual effects and how it's had a ripple effect outwardly from those affected from trauma to those who surround them, their children, their nieces and nephews, the community. Everyone is not, protected. There are so many ways people are affected in an emotional, spiritual, physical, and intellectual way, as demonstrated in the circle of life, and continues to be felt in the subsequent generation. So the survivor's trauma is all within the medicine wheel. Each and every one of us that sits here today carries medicine. And can you just imagine not having the medicine of what we have today and what our survivors had to deal with and still today continue to deal with? Some of those health issues, some of those emotional, deep traumatic wounds, memory lapses, difficulty concentrating, all of these things, loss of who you are, loss of security and belongingness, loss of faith in humanity, distrust, a lot of distrust, and then subsequent generations being affected. And in that comes learned behaviors of coping to the past that are passed on, because they're the hidden legacy. They don't know why they're coping this way, but this is what's happening. The cycle continues of misuse of substance, FASD bursts, cycle of apprehension, poverty, gang activity, criminal activity, violence, and the cycle of sexual abuse, past and ongoing. Intergenerational impacts again in the circle of life for the children of the survivors and the great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren now. There's a significant factor to consider how bonding. Oops, sorry, my little mouse wants to take off on me here. So we want to talk about how the bonding relationships between the parents and their children and their natural community and cultural supports were violated, taken away, experiencing that trauma, in care being traumatized. All of these things have a huge impact on how individuals cope today. In my work at the agency, thankfully, I'm so grateful that participants are able to say, I was triggered, Debbie, this is what happened to me. I need to speak about it. And I'm like, wow, you're making connections. Let's do this. And really embrace it at their pace and safely, safe space culturally and safety. And so we're beginning to restore. But we are undoing spiritual confusion. This is what we're doing now. In my example of that disclosure to me, the individual had flashbacks of being treated terribly in their foster care and struggling to embrace their culture. And I'm like, it's okay. Go at your pace. It's okay. Just take your time. I'm here for you. How that conflicts and causes confusion, and how it can create an imbalance in the individual. So we want to look at how to restore safely, cultural safe areas for individuals to restore their spirit. because many of our participants we support are transgender, intergenerationally affected by the impacts of their grandparents and their parents attending Indian residential schools. Still today, many of these deep-rooted pains, hurts and harms are reflective on what happens to them today. And so though it's so critical to have those cultural safe spaces and those cultural ceremonies and practices in those cultural places. Because I want to speak about the intergenerational trauma that indigenous elders often say that memory is a blood and bone, that our stories are passed not just verbally, but through the kind of genetic memory. Scholars call it epigenetics. We know that experiences in the environment can turn on or off genes. So the function of those genes is changed. Now, I had the blessing to get the permission to use Elder Bombay quote here from my work in the Indian residential schools that in my past work, one of the TRC events. Elder Bombay explains in terms of how that is transmitted generationally. We know that if these changes happen to be in the genetics line, so in the egg and sperm, they have the potential to be transmitted across generations. But there's another offset to that, because with the genetics of there's also intergenerational ancestral gifts. So I speak about that. There's always has to be balance in life. And that's something we need to focus on more, is that other side of balance of epigenetics that our participants and our people carry, as opposed to what was in their genetics and how to help them in their healing. But we are dealing with 40 years of systematic marginalization. And according to Gittin, 1998, the intergenerational trauma is the transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations. Well, wait a minute. I still want to talk about that other side of balance, because what's happening now is we tried to keep quiet, but our ancestors wouldn't let us. But we had help with this. And I look at this sacred fire here, because that's the sacred fire Eshkoti within all of us. So what can we do to promote dignity in the spirit of truth and reconciliation? And this is what we need. We need to restore, not the big X, we need to restore cultural identity and structures. Restore. We need to learn about those stories that people have courageously come and spoke about through April Rain Tree, many tender ties, and some really good resources that are available for all of us to learn. We need to learn more about the TRC report, because the TRC report at that time talked about cultural genocide and how it manifested in racism, systematic discrimination, poverty, and dying indigenous languages. I want to speak about, well, I want to call him Elder, and he was our senator and the leader of Truth and Reconciliation at the time when I was working. When he spoke about describing, he talks about, we have described your mountain. We have shown you a path to the top, and we call upon you all to do the climbing. So the final report has some of those answers that will help all of us. And that includes helping in ways to restore disruptions to families that from that time prevented transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. All of these are all of the ways that think through the Indian Residential Schools Agreement, and so on from 2007 on to 2021, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. All of these are ways that things are beginning to be restored. And I'm going to exemplify a bit of them. Okay. We want to speak about 2019, that the Canadian Museum of Human Rights identifies what happened to Indigenous people as genocide, not cultural genocide, but genocide. Killing their members, lots of evidence causing bodily harm, imposing measures intended to prevent births, which happened in 2016, where the senator was helping the ladies to disclose their forced sterilization. That's 2016, and these women were being forced sterilization. Evidence is there. Forcibly transferring children to one group to another. These are all of them. But what I'm proud to say is our agency, like Jeremy, signed in the court and are committed to these calls to action as well as the calls to justice. I encourage people to read about reclaiming power and place and examining the calls to action. There is a short form of the calls to action right here, and redressing, the red dress, to redress history and the faces of a lot of the missing and murdered women. So these are them. I also encourage that every reconciliation piece is for everyone. So reconciliation right invites us all to relationship build, to further talk and read about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, reclaiming power and place. Again, learning more about it, culture, religion, the UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration Rights of Indigenous People, their identity, health and community, language and education. Reconciliation again needs us all. We've got resources through the pathways of reconciliation and application and action. These are resources available because the circle of life asks us to come together in kinship, join in diversity of all cultures, because reconciliation is everybody's work. Invite everyone to ask questions. Is it okay to ask, to be curious? Absolutely. Reflect on everything about reconciliation with the families, the individuals. Build those relationships and so forth. Because unity kinship is committing to truth-telling, reconciliation, and humanity, and supporting the unconditional rights of Indigenous Manitobas to access cultural, safe, and responsive care. This is really, the circle of life is the answer. We also want to acknowledge September the 30th as a day to learn. So C35 that was introduced in June, for all of us to take that time and learn on all throughout the year, but dedicated to September 30th. And again, the province acknowledging this time as September 30th. The province of Manitoba releasing, these are ways to begin our learning. Reaching out to elders. So I'm going to give you some examples of truth and reconciliation events. Our agency, because of the discoveries of the children that were found in unmarked graves and camels, we were our participants, oh my goodness, and staff, and I was full of tears, and we were locked down. But then the Gitche Manitou brought us together, and all of a sudden, let's get together, we can do it now. So we did some honoring the children events. We did one in Winnipeg on July, in Steinbach on August, at our office areas, in September in Brandon. We did tobacco offerings, we feasted the children, we sung songs, we did everything we could in a COVID safe way so that individuals could, honor the children in a dignified way. Then, to honor the children further, we brought in a week of learning at the agency from September 27th to October 1st. And so I presented everyday information about, the history. Some of you know that I have a nice little outline of the Indian Act and the years of all the policies they created and the residential schools. All of these things were released to the agency to learn. And on September 29th, Wednesday, we did an honoring of Truth and Reconciliation Orange Shirt Day for Every Child Matters. Our handouts were given to everyone. And there's Mel and Ken and Graham and all of us, we made cookies. And I went out and I gifted one of our partners a flag. It was beautiful. And we decorated our fence at 125 Higgins. It was a beautiful day. Further in Brandon, a week of learning in Brandon, which is amazing. And these are ways. And again, on October 4th, we did the Murder Missing Indigenous women and girls and 2 LGBTQ1A people, as well as an event for participants to create a red dress to hang in their windows to honor the women. And I encourage people to read the Claiming Power in Place. It's a huge document, but it's worthwhile reading. Oh my goodness. I think I know it backwards and inwards, but here we go. Most pieces that I can share is restoring the sacred. We know that Indigenous cultures and traditional ceremony practices safeguards the spirit and inspires life into the body, mind, and emotions. Indigenous spirituality, ceremonies, and practices saves lives. That is tapping into that intergenerational resilience. How we can help individuals restore and learn about epigenetics, the other side of that balance of epigenetics. There's the epigenetics of ancestral knowledge. So return, and now is confirmed through research that resilience can be taught, learned, and cultivated. Cultivated is what I love to do. I like to go in and find the gifts. The ancestors wait for that participant to share. Because resilience is so important. It has shaped the aspects of united spiritually, family strengths, grandmothers, knowledge keepers, and everything that supports circles, most importantly, restores dignity of Indigenous identity. Indigenous resilience originates outside of the individual. It is in the family, community, nation, culture, and land creation, the land-based teachings, Mother Earth's teachings. An Indigenous perspective of resilience focuses on the gifts of the individual, family, community, nation. In these views, we all are supported by this circle. The ways of knowing, life wisdom that's passed on to the next generation. Indigenous resilience focuses on the identity, strengths, and gifts of all people. I use these circles. I love them because it's a ripple effect, and if what we can bless people with and gift them, it's a ripple effect. Like many of our participants are teaching their family members, and it's beautiful. I love it. Or their new staff. So indigenous resilience is also a trust and a knowingness that every individual is supported spiritually by their ancestors of 7 generations ago. I got a shield here, and these are my helpers. They're my ancestors. Our ancestors' ways of knowing, ceremonies and practices are rooted in our DNA, genes, along with the trauma that bound. Some examples of that would be, now I know I walk with my ancestors because I got 200 behind me. I love that. And I tell participants, you have the strength of all your ancestors of 7 generations ago. I don't walk alone, neither do they. My ancestors are with me. They carry my spirit during the challenging times of my life. They walk in prayer with me every day. I don't stand alone, and I share that with participants. Indigenous identity and culture is respecting the elders, listening to the teachings. These are a few I'll touch. Listening and learning from the younger generation, really important. Learning about one's Indigenous identity through ceremony, that naming, colors, and clan, and learning the responsibilities of that name and how to honor that name. To as well, the land base, the universal teachings of Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun, and all our relations. Grandma Moon, Granny, she's in the sky. You can see her, and she could be a relation. So grandmother loves you. Grandfather loves you. Look at all the love he gives to you, the heat and the loving, all of that can be used in our ways of supporting individuals in Indigenous perspective. Storytelling is part of that, and I use that a lot. Caring and looking after each other's brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, grandmothers and grandfathers. And that was one of the reasons why I asked for my name changes, because their grandmother is a relation, and I love that. So the participants can look at me as a relation to them. There are many ways to restore dignity and bringing those ceremonies and practices in, pipe ceremonies, fall and spring equinox, those summer solstice, grief and loss ceremonies, those full moon ceremonies, using the medicine wheel to spiritually counsel individuals, using the sacred fire as part of that. Sweat lodge ceremonies, we haven't had any for 2 years, but they're all in our hearts still. The circle of life offers so many things that brings us together. But cultural safety is one of the most important pieces. Further to that, in Manitoba, we're very diverse in our languages and ways of presenting culture. So we have many ceremonies that we offer that I may not have I'm not practicing maybe myself, but they're here. Tying up ceremony, the shaking tent, sunrise ceremony, the marriage ceremony, many of those things. Teaching about the 7 sacred teachings, the knowledge about their ancestors and how these teachings are ancestors that support us, like I spoke about in my shield, and how we can apply them as a code of ethics for our life. And then the Dakota teachings, diversities in culture, and how we can all learn about all of them and bringing them into the circles. 8 ways of healing. They say there's 7, but I like to say there's the singing that honors everything to empower the individual to heal. Gifts. how we use the east direction, earth, grounding, connect, begin, give, south direction, zone on, the emotional heart, the air, observe, breathe, focus, decide, reconnect, the west, nigibong, the water, cleansing, crying, letting go, releasing, flow, know, the fire, attain, burn, change, ignite, and shine. Adapted to the medicine of the circle of life. This is Mother Earth's creation, the gifts that she gives to us. Our well-being circle of Minimamatis, when belonging to sense, power to feel, purpose to do, identity to know, to bring connection of who we are. Again, everything in the circle of life, cultural knowledge, new beginnings, expressing feelings, feasting, ceremonies, that physical. The spiritual heart center of our being is the root to the mind-body connection. Turning on to your heart is the root of the mind-body connection. Healing comes through the center of our heart. Learning, key to living a good life. Intuitive connection between mind and heart is living when the good life. Most importantly, to achieve cultural safety. What does that look like? What we can do is start to identify our differences and recognize there's probably resemblances in all cultures, and respecting and appreciating all these cultural ways to engage in mutual learning about cultural ways and knowledge gain. Brings out relationship support and equality. To maintain that by lifelong learning, like we're doing today, the mini series is our lifelong learning, leads to relationship trust and empathy and well-being of our participants, care or the people we serve, our communities. Because it is about the outcomes of belongingness, strong relationships, safe spaces, equality, empathy, empowerment, support, and practicing indigenous healing and ceremonies and cultural events, and the direction. So I've got a two-eyed seeing approach here, the arrows and the circle of life, how that works and everything about it. So I want to just talk about quickly an indigenous approach to helpers self-care using the medicine wheel. I want to share this with you because we do some great work. We need to take care of ourselves. So here is a model that is here for all of us to care for ourselves. Placing what are your spiritual ways of caring for yourself? What are your emotional ways? What are your physical ways? What are your intellectual ways? All of these have a really, really full way of bringing balance to ourselves as helpers. Now to close for today, I'm going to share a dream. Everybody's going to go out and do some wild blueberry picking after this one. I had a dream. And in the dream, they told me, in offering tobacco in prayer, we call upon the bear spirit. The bear spirit is the healer of addiction. We call upon the grandfather bear spirit to heal the trauma, past and present. We call upon grandfather bear to guide to the path of healing, mind, emotions, to restore spirit. The medicine gift to the people is the blueberry plant. That's what they told me. One wild blueberry is like a pill, they told me. The healing color is blue. And that's true in our ways. And it is the wild blueberry. I want to say Gishimegwich to each and every one of you for being here today. Gishimegwich. And that is the end of our presentation today. So if there's any questions, I know I'm at 1 o'clock on the dot.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nokomis Debbie, for that. I will just, before I say closing remarks, to see, I haven't seen any questions come up into the chat yet, but if anyone wants a moment to type in some questions, we can field those for a couple minutes here. I'm going to reference your presentation by saying it's okay to ask questions and be curious.
Yep. Everybody knows that about me.
Indeed, yeah.
It's so important to be approachable.
Yeah.
Great, Mary.
Okay, well, maybe then people can chat in as I'm talking. I'll just go through our closing remarks here though. But again, just thank you so much, Nokomis Debbie, for sharing your knowledge with us this afternoon. It's just so impactful and so important to have an awareness of all these stories and the truths that you spoke on today so that we can, you know, bring with us that deeper understanding into the relationships that we have with, whether it's as caregivers or service providers or community members. It's so important. So thank you so much. And every time I hear you speak, I leave with my heart full and with a new sense of purpose. So thank you for that. There was a link in the chat to a survey for evaluating the session. So if you are able to click on that and complete that, we appreciate your input and comments because it does help us in planning for our future sessions. If you would like to become a member of the coalition, you can complete the, send an email to, that I'll put in the chat to coordinator@fasdcoalition.ca and we can help you with that. And we do have, as was mentioned in the beginning, there's our next workshop, which will be held on Friday, May 6th, about FASD within the school system. So we hope to see you there. And I'm just going to type into that email address into the chat for folks who might want to become a member if you're not already. Great, and I don't see any questions, so thank you, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to join us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next info series in May. Have a great weekend.
Team Equate to everyone.